Most fraud stories are about a bad person who fooled a good person. The con artist, the target, a clear line between them. This story is different. Klaus Ziegler spent 30 years in logistics learning to read men, their loyalty, their honesty, the specific way a person carries themselves when they have nothing to hide. He read Junjun Calledo correctly. 30 years of experience, and he got his man exactly right. The problem was the woman Junjun trusted. And the problem with that was that Klaus never thought to look that far. This is what happens when the thief is 2 handshakes away, and the man in the middle never knew he was carrying her through the door. The worst meeting of my professional life was not with a banker, not with a customs authority, not with any of the difficult counterparties that 30 years of freight logistics in Munich had put across a table from me. It was in a small office above a vehicle compound in Cebu City, on a Tuesday afternoon in February, with Junjun Calledo sitting across from me, while an auditor read figures from a laptop screen. I had run through difficult meetings in my career. I had sat across from men who had lied to me, who had manipulated contracts, who had taken more than they were owed, and prepared their defense in advance. I knew what a guilty man looked like when the evidence was put in front of him. I had seen that expression, the flicker of calculation, the mental repositioning, the microsecond when a man decides what his story is going to be. Junjun's face showed none of that. What it showed was something I had not been prepared for. He sat in that chair, and he listened to the figures, and his expression went through shock, then confusion, then a particular kind of devastation that I recognized before I understood why I recognized it, and then I understood. It was the same expression I had seen on men who had been betrayed by someone they loved. Not guilt, grief, he said. In English that was careful and precise in the way his English always was. She told me those invoices were for the gearbox servicing. I signed them. I believed her. He didn't say anything else for a long time. Then he said, "I will give you my motorcycle." He said it with complete seriousness. He had a Honda Wave, perhaps 8 years old, probably worth 40,000 pesos. The discrepancy we were looking at was 175,000 euros. The man had nothing, and he offered me his motorcycle because it was the only thing he had, and he needed to offer me something. Because in his understanding of the world, a man who has wronged another man must offer something, even when the something cannot cover what it represents. I told him to keep the motorcycle. He looked at me like he didn't understand why I would say that, and I didn't have the words in that moment to explain that there was nothing he owed me that was in his power to pay, and that the motorcycle was not the thing I was thinking about anyway. What I was thinking about was Maricel Abad, whom I had met twice, who had never spoken more than pleasantries to me, who had been the bookkeeper of an operation I had built on the back of 30 years of professional judgment, and who had walked out of that operation with the bulk of 175,000 euros in an arrangement so elegant that it had taken a forensic accountant from Manila 3 weeks to fully reconstruct it. Let me tell you how I got there. I need to tell the whole story, because the whole story is the lesson, and the lesson is not the one I expected to be teaching myself at 67. I built a freight logistics company in Munich over 30 years. Started with 2 trucks and a leased warehouse in Garching, grew it to 18 vehicles and contracts with 4 of the major industrial suppliers in the greater Munich area. The work was not glamorous. Logistics never is. But it was solid and consistent, and I was good at it in the specific way that comes from understanding that the business of moving things from one place to another is fundamentally a business of trust. Shippers trust you with their goods. Clients trust you with their timelines. Employees trust you with their livelihoods. And you, at the center of all that trust, are only as reliable as the weakest link in the chain. I sold the company in 2019 to a larger logistics group that had been sniffing around for 2 years. The sale price was fair. My business partner Werner, who had joined me in year 8, and who I regard as one of the most decent men I have worked alongside in my professional life, retired to his village in Bavaria and sends me photographs of his grandchildren on WhatsApp. I had no grandchildren to photograph. My marriage to Inga had ended in 2008. Our son Felix was in Toronto, doing something with environmental consulting that I understood in the same general but not specific way I understood most things about the modern world, and my retirement in Munich had the quality that comfortable retirements sometimes have, well arranged and slightly purposeless. I came to the Philippines because Werner's brother-in-law had retired there, and talked about it at a dinner in 2021, with the enthusiasm of a man whose heating bills had permanently become someone else's problem. I was not looking for adventure, I was looking for warmth and lower costs, and the feeling of starting something that wasn't simply the continuation of something already established. I went to Cebu because Werner's brother-in-law was in Cebu, and had contacts and could show me where the practical realities sat beneath the promotional version of the place that the internet presented. The van rental idea came to me in my second month. Cebu's tourism infrastructure had specific gaps that a man who had spent 30 years thinking about vehicle logistics could identify clearly. The resorts and conference hotels needed reliable transport for guests, airport transfers, corporate shuttle services, and the existing providers were inconsistent in ways that made corporate clients nervous. I had capital, I had operational knowledge, and I had the specific advantage of not needing to make the business work in year one, which meant I could invest in quality and reliability while competitors were cutting margins. What I needed was someone on the ground who knew Cebu and could manage day-to-day operations in a way that didn't require me to be physically present every day. Werner's brother-in-law, whose name was Franz, and who had married a Cebuano woman named Perla, and who genuinely knew the city after 6 years in it, introduced me to Junjun. Junjun Calledo was 34 when I met him. He had been driving for a hotel shuttle service for 7 years, and before that, had worked at a vehicle rental company for 3 years. He was quiet and precise, and he had an understanding of Cebu's road geography that was encyclopedic. He knew not just the routes but the specific times of day when certain roads were faster or slower, which was the kind of practical knowledge you cannot get from a map, and that only comes from years of actual navigation. He was also, and this is the thing I assessed most carefully because it mattered most, honest. I have 30 years of practice at reading honesty in men. I am not talking about the performed honesty of someone who knows they're being assessed. I am talking about the structural honesty of a person for whom straightforwardness is not a strategy, but a character trait. Junjun was that. He told me when he didn't know something. He told me when he'd made a mistake before I would have found it myself. He disagreed with me 3 times in the first 2 months of us working together, and he was right each of the 3 times, which I respected more than I would have respected a man who always agreed. I made him operations manager in month 4. 6 vehicles, 3 vans purchased, 3 leased, with contracts already signed with 2 hotels and 1 corporate client, and Junjun handling the driver scheduling, vehicle maintenance coordination, and the daily cash reconciliation with the bookkeeping templates I had set up. The system was not complicated. Daily income recorded, maintenance costs logged against specific vehicles, weekly summaries to me by email. I checked the summaries. They were clear and consistent. The business grew in year 1 in ways that confirmed the gap I had identified. We added a 4th van in September, and a 5th in December. Corporate clients referred us to other corporate clients, which is how logistics always works when the service is what it's supposed to be. Junjun managed the growth with the same quiet competence he'd brought to the original operation, and the only thing that changed in his professional behavior as his responsibilities increased was that he sent his email summaries an hour earlier each week, which I interpreted as the behavior of a man who was proud of what he was managing and wanted to show the work rather than hide it. I met Maricel Abad for the first time in the spring of year 2. Junjun mentioned her first in a Friday email, a line at the bottom, below the weekly summary, saying he had been seeing someone seriously and hoped he might introduce her one day. I thought nothing of it. He introduced her 2 weeks later at the compound during a vehicle inspection I was conducting with a mechanic, and she came with Junjun in his car and stood at a respectful distance while we worked, and then joined us for coffee at the small table outside the compound office afterward. She was 29 then. She was from the Labangon area of Cebu City, had worked in the accounting department of a shopping mall for several years, and had met Junjun at a cousin's wedding in February. She was pleasant, and she asked sensible questions about the business, the kind of questions that someone with a bookkeeping background asks, questions about fleet depreciation and contract structure, and I answered them and thought she seemed like an intelligent woman with professional knowledge that was relevant to what Junjun was managing. That's the extent of my direct assessment of Maricel Abad. 2 meetings, approximately 3 hours of combined contact. Pleasant, intelligent, professional background. That was all I had. And because I had correctly assessed Junjun, and because I trusted Junjun completely, and because Junjun's girlfriend was an extension of Junjun in my mental model of the operation, I did not think about Maricel Abad again for the better part of a year. That is the error. Not the error of trusting the wrong person. I trusted the right person. The error of treating trust as transitive, as if the properties of one person flow automatically to the people they love. Junjun mentioned in August of year 2 that Marisel had been helping him with the bookkeeping in the evenings. He mentioned it in the context of the summaries getting more detailed. She had restructured the template to include a maintenance cost breakdown by vehicle that I had, in fact, found useful and had commented on positively. I said that was good, the new template was cleaner. Junjun seemed pleased that I'd noticed. I didn't ask any further questions about the arrangement. I should have. That is another error. A man who spent 30 years thinking about who has access to what, in an operational chain, should have asked a question about who was preparing the documents he was reviewing. I did not ask, because Junjun was the person in my trust chain, and Marisel was Junjun's person, and the chain felt complete. The first sign that something was wrong arrived in the form of a maintenance invoice in October of year 2 that seemed high for the work described. I sent Junjun a query. He replied the same evening with a breakdown that he said he'd gotten from the garage, a shop in Mandaue, a name I didn't recognize but had no particular reason to question. The breakdown was detailed. I accepted it and moved on. In December, I noticed the fuel costs for Van 3 were running about 15% above what the same vehicle had been costing in the previous 3 months. I mentioned it to Junjun. He said he'd look into it. The following week, he reported that a driver had been making inefficient route choices and had been corrected. The fuel costs for January were back within expected range. I accepted that explanation too. Both of those individual items, reviewed individually, were plausible. A high maintenance invoice for an older vehicle, an inefficient driver corrected. These are normal operational events in a fleet business. I was applying the individual item assessment that had served me well in logistics, where you investigate specific anomalies in context and move on when the context is satisfied. What I was not doing was looking at the aggregate. I was not stepping back from the individual items and looking at the shape of the overall picture, which is the thing I would have done without thinking in Munich, but which I was not doing in Cebu, because I was in a posture of trust rather than a posture of oversight. The business collapsed, or rather, the cash position became critical in a way that made collapse imminent. In March of year 3, I attempted to pay a lease renewal on 2 vehicles, and the operating account was insufficient. The account should have had approximately 28,000 euros in it, based on the revenue I knew we'd taken in the previous quarter. It had 6,400 euros. I called Junjun. He was as confused as I was, which I registered immediately, and which was the first moment I began to understand that something was happening that was outside his knowledge as well as mine. He came to the office. We went through the records together. Junjun's records showed the income he'd logged. The income he'd logged was consistent with the contracts I knew about. The account balance was not consistent with the income logged. The gap was not a small discrepancy. It was systematic and substantial. I engaged Franz's recommendation, a forensic accountant from Manila named Mr. Reyes, who worked with business disputes and whose firm had handled similar situations in the Visayas region. He flew to Cebu and spent 3 weeks with the records. I want to describe what he found in plain terms, because plain terms are what it deserves. Maricel Abad had been operating a parallel bookkeeping system from the beginning of her involvement with Junjun's management of the accounts. The parallel system diverted a portion of each corporate contract payment at the point of deposit, the deposit going to an account she controlled, the record shown to Junjun reflecting the balance after the diversion. Junjun was signing off on the records she prepared without knowing that the records had been prepared against a different underlying reality. The maintenance invoices were a second channel. The garage in Mandaue, the one whose name I hadn't recognized, was owned by her brother. The invoices were for work that was either not performed or substantially overpriced. Junjun, who knew vehicles well enough to know whether work had been done, but not well enough to know whether the price was inflated against industry rates, had been signing the invoices on Marisel's instruction because she said they were correct and he trusted her. The third channel was the most sophisticated. 2 of our corporate clients were billed double for certain service runs. One bill going through the official contract, one through a separate billing entity that Marisel had registered in a name I did not recognize. One of the clients had flagged the double billing 8 months earlier, but the flag had gone to an email address that was on our official correspondence, but that Marisel had redirected to her own inbox. The client, receiving no response, had assumed an error and paid whichever invoice arrived first. The total across all 3 channels, over approximately 14 months of active operation after Marisel became involved in the bookkeeping, was 131,000 euros. Combined with the approximately 44,000 euros I had spent in setup costs beyond the vehicles, the total investment loss was 175,000 euros. Marisel was not present when Mr. Reyes presented the findings. She had left Cebu approximately 6 weeks before I engaged the auditor, which timing Mr. Reyes described as consistent with someone who had been monitoring the situation and identified the point at which continued extraction became risky. Her location at the time of the audit was not confirmed. Junjun said she had told him she was visiting family in Manila. She had not responded to messages since. Junjun's face. I need to come back to Junjun's face, because it is the center of the story, and because it is the thing I have thought about the most in the months since. He sat in that office, and he listened to Mr. Reyes describe what had been done through the access that Junjun had provided, unwittingly, through his trust in a woman he loved. He listened to the maintenance invoice channel, and I could see in his face the specific moment when he understood what the invoices had been. Not technical documents that required bookkeeping expertise he didn't have, but a con that had used his competence in one area, knowing the work was done, to obscure his incompetence in another, knowing whether the price was honest. He had been used precisely at the intersection of what he knew and what he didn't, which is where cons always operate. When Mr. Reyes finished, Junjun sat in silence for a while. Then he said, "She asked me to sign everything. She said it was because my signature was the operations manager's signature, and the clients expected it. I said, I know. He said I trusted her. I said, I know you did. He said I didn't know she was doing this. I said, Junjun, I know." He looked at me with the expression I have described, not guilt, grief, and he said, "I am responsible. She did this with my hands." That sentence has been with me since that afternoon. She did this with my hands. He was precisely right about that, and precisely wrong about its moral meaning. He was right that her operation had run through him. He was wrong that this made him responsible in the sense he meant, culpable, at fault, liable. He was a good man, who had been used by someone who understood the machinery of his goodness well enough to operate it. He offered me the motorcycle. I told him to keep it. He looked like he didn't understand why. I tried to find the words, and what I said was, "Junjun, you gave me 3 years of honest work. That's what I hired you for. What happened with the money is not what I hired you for." He looked at me for a long time, and I think he understood what I was saying, and I think it did not make him feel significantly better, because a man who holds himself to a standard and has fallen below it does not easily receive absolution from outside. We shook hands when he left. His grip was the same as it had always been, firm, direct, the handshake of a man who means the handshake. That has not changed, and will not change, because it was never the thing in question. I want to talk about what I did wrong, because I am 67 years old, and I have spent my professional life identifying and correcting operational errors, and I am going to apply that discipline to myself, even when the result is uncomfortable. I trusted transitively. That is the plain description. I evaluated Junjun, found him trustworthy, and extended that trust to the people he trusted without re-evaluating them independently. This is not how I would have run Munich. In Munich, I verified the bonding and background of every person who had financial access to the company, regardless of who recommended them, and regardless of how long I'd worked with the recommending party. I had a rule, and the rule was that trust in a specific person is not transferable to a different person on the basis of the trusted person's recommendation alone. I applied that rule for 30 years in Germany. I did not apply it in Cebu, because in Cebu I was not in my professional mindset. I was in a different mindset, the mindset of a man building something new in a place he was still learning, relying on a person he trusted, and by extension, on the people around that person, without stopping to separate those two categories clearly. There is also this. Marisel was a woman, and Junjun's girlfriend, and the bookkeeper in the evenings, and something in the way I categorized her placed her outside the chain I was monitoring. She was not a contractor, she was not an employee, she had no formal role and no formal access in the way I thought about access. And because she was not formally in the chain, I did not think about the access she had through Junjun, the passwords, the templates, the invoices that went through his hands, because his signature was the one that mattered. The access was total, because the access was informal, and the most dangerous access is always informal, because formal access has controls built around it, and informal access has trust, which is not a control. I have been in Munich for 7 months since the audit. Franz and Perla visited in June, and we had dinner, and Franz was careful with the subject of the business, and I appreciated the care. Werner came over in September for our annual lunch, and I told him the full story, and he listened in the way Werner always listens, with the complete attention of a man who does not multitask. When I finished, he said, "You judged your man correctly." I said yes. He said, "That counts for something." I said I was working out how much. Felix called from Toronto when I told him. He is not a sentimental man. He got that from Ingi, who is also not a sentimental man in most respects, but he asked careful questions, and at the end he said, "Dad, you built something real. It was taken from you through a channel you hadn't thought to watch. That's not a failure of your judgment. It's a gap in your system." I said that distinction was perhaps too generous. He said, "Take the distinction, Dad. It's accurate." I think he was right. The judgment was sound. The system had a gap. The gap was the informal access of a person I had not assessed, because the person was 2 handshakes away from me, and I had not thought to extend my assessment that far. The question of what happens to Maricel Abad is a practical and a legal one that is being handled by a Cebu-based lawyer, and that I am told has the realistic prospects that cross-jurisdictional financial fraud cases typically have, which is to say, pursuit is possible, recovery is uncertain, the timeline is long. I have made my peace with uncertain and long. I spent 30 years in logistics learning that some things do not arrive on the schedule you planned, and that rage at the delay costs more than it recovers. What I am doing now in Munich is what I should probably have done when I first arrived in Cebu, which is to take my time. I have the capital still, reduced but not eliminated. I have the knowledge. I have the contacts. I have Franz and Perla, and their view of Cebu that is longer than mine, and more grounded in its actual mechanics. I have been talking to Franz about a smaller operation. Not 6 vehicles, 2, perhaps 3. A more limited scope with tighter controls, and a formal accounting arrangement with a firm that I engage and supervise independently of whoever manages the day-to-day. The lesson is not that the Philippines is dangerous and Munich is safe. The lesson is that every operation requires that I know who has access to what, in what form, regardless of who recommended them, and regardless of how many handshakes they are from me. Junjun has a different job now. He's driving for a hotel shuttle service again. The same kind of work he was doing before I arrived, which has a rightness to it that I find both sad and appropriate. I have paid him 3 months' severance, which was more than his contract required, and less than what his 3 years of honest work deserved, and which he accepted with the same directness he brings to everything. He did not thank me with excessive words. He shook my hand. I think about the motorcycle sometimes. The specific image of it, a man with nothing, offering the one thing he has, because the framework he lives inside says you must offer something when you have cost someone something, even when the costing was done through you, rather than by you. I find that image one of the more affecting things I have encountered in my professional life, which has contained a reasonable number of affecting things. I did not take the motorcycle. I would not take it. But I think about it. Trust is only as strong as its weakest bystander. That is what I wrote in my notebook on the flight back to Munich, and it is what I have been thinking about since. Not the weakest person in the chain, the weakest bystander, the person adjacent to the chain, unseen, unassessed, operating through the access that the trusted person carries, without knowing they're carrying it. I trusted my man. My man trusted her. She trusted no one. That asymmetry is the lesson I am taking back to whatever I build next. Not suspicion, not the refusal to trust, just the discipline to extend assessment as far as access actually reaches, regardless of how many handshakes that is from me. 2 handshakes is close enough to matter. I know that now. I will not forget it again.